Hello, Pulpit listeners. This is Johnny Gwynn, co-host and producer of this show. Just a friendly reminder, Reverend Gibson's sermon will be on the very first part of the show. Then we'll have our intro music, and then our discussion will follow. We hope you enjoy this episode.
At the end of all his work in creation, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Then the book of Genesis tells us, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And the seventh day God finished the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day, and hallowed it, made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation." Sabbath is a crucial element in the divine rhythm of being, woven into the creation itself. Created by God and set apart from everything else, made holy. On the seventh day, God rested, and said that all creation should rest as well. You would think then that in our very being, in our DNA, we would know this, and we would know how to honor it. But human nature being what it is, after the fall, a formal commandment was necessary, and so we have the detailed prescriptions and proscriptions of the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien residents in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now you might think that that would be sufficient to make clear to us God's intentions for how we should order the rhythms of our lives. But no. Human nature, again, and our self-created forms and institutions can and will and do distort even that clear command, leading, among other things, to the kind of hyper-moral vigilance that we see among the religious authorities in the gospel lesson this past Sunday. On the Sabbath, Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields, and as they were hungry, they plucked some of the heads of grain and ate them. The Pharisees, the religious authorities, saw this and accused them of violating the Sabbath laws. Again, in the synagogue on the Sabbath, Jesus was being watched by the Pharisees, and when a man with a withered hand came to him for healing, Jesus did so. Again, he was rebuked by the religious authorities. Jesus' reaction to the Pharisees' policing of the Sabbath was both anger at their distortion of God's offering of grace, and grief at their hardness of heart. His point is compassion. He says, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath." The Sabbath is meant to be life-giving, whole-making, healing, and not another outlet for harshness and hurt and violence. So what should the Sabbath look like? When the Decalogue says, "Remember the Sabbath," it does not mean the kind of remembering we are prone to do sometimes, a kind of romanticized, nostalgic longing for what we believe was a simpler time, usually the time of our own childhood and our younger adult self. There is no way, of course, we can or should imitate the practice of another time and place. The movement of the Holy Spirit is ongoing and ever fresh. Remember the Sabbath by considering its intent and its importance, and by honoring its place in our lives. In his book, Sabbath, Finding Rest, Renewal, and Delight in Our Busy Lives, Wayne Muller begins with this sentence: "In the relentless busyness of modern life, we have lost the rhythm between work and rest. He wrote that in the late 1990s, and since that time, I think it is safe to say, we have created and embraced whole new technologies and ways of living that have gone so far as to make even our rest into work. We feel compelled to document the activities of our rest and to share them and encourage others to like them, and so we work at relaxing, and we are killing our souls in the process. Our way of living is a kind of violence, although that may sound extreme. Think about this. The Chinese pictograph for busy is composed of two characters, heart and killing. Even our ways of doing good succumb to this way of being. Here is Thomas Merton, writing in the 1960s. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything is to succumb to violence. When we say then that we have forgotten the Sabbath, we don't mean in the simple or naive sense of ignoring the day. We mean that we have forgotten that the Sabbath was meant to be, and can still be, a far-reaching, powerful tool for cultivating what is precious in human life. Those qualities that can only grow and unfold in time, protected time, consecrated time, set aside for listening to the still small voices and hearing the inner wisdom that God gives. Rest and reflection, the true essence of the Sabbath, is perhaps the only place we can hear God speak. Our reading about God's calling of young Samuel this past Sunday is a perfect illustration of how this works. The lamp in the temple burned all night, and as it had not yet gone out, it was just before dawn when young Samuel heard a voice call his name. Samuel, Samuel. Samuel's bed was inside the temple, near the sanctuary where the Ark of God was kept. A portable shrine, the Ark was, a kind of chest representing God's presence. Samuel did not yet know the Lord, meaning his role as a prophet had not yet been revealed or established. He had not heard God speak. He only knew his teacher, Eli. 3 times the call came to Samuel, and each time he ran to Eli to find out what he needed him to do, what work Eli had for him. Finally, Eli realized that God was speaking to the boy, and he told him what to do. Eli sent Samuel back to his bed and told him to lie there quietly, wait for the voice to speak again, and then say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." At last, then, Samuel stops running about, being ready to do, and says what his wise teacher told him. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." How can we bring ourselves to that place, that state of being, where, like Samuel, we say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening"? That is also the place where, like Jesus' disciples, we can have our hunger for peace and wholeness fed, and where, like the man with the withered hand, we can be healed. We must let the Sabbath come. We cannot do or make the Sabbath. We are starting that allowing, that letting, when we allow ourselves the peace of worship. In our Sabbath worship, the moment that we quiet ourselves in the pew, the moment the first prayer is offered, time is transformed. The Sabbath comes to us. It moves Sabbath time as it will, through us, without our doing violence to it or to ourselves. But that hour is only the beginning, the source, the well, for the full Sabbath that flows through all of our lives. Jesus told his disciples, "Make your home in me as I make mine in you." This homemaking needs a protected zone around worship and within our lives in order to happen. This weekly worship needs protected time around it, and your daily life, my daily life, needs a protected time and space for rest and reflection, for listening for God's voice, feeling the breath of fresh air that is the moving of the Holy Spirit. For our work to be fruitful and guided by wisdom, Sabbath rest must surround it. Last summer was a sabbatical time for me. You hear the word Sabbath in that word. It was meant to be a time for rest and reflection. But if you ask my family about the experience, they will tell you it was more like a forced march. So I find that the time for rest and reflection must come now. Likewise, our years of work and planning for the future of our life together at Christ Church Cathedral must now allow the coming of a time of rest and reflection on and in our life together as we embark on this new chapter. To close this time of reflection, I would like to offer you a poem that captures the essence of letting Sabbath come, presented here at the evening of the day and of life. This is Let Evening Come by Jane Kenyon. Let the light of late afternoon shine through the chinks in the barn, moving up the bales as the sun moves down. Let the cricket take up chafing as a woman takes up her needles and her yarn. Let evening come. Let dew collect on the hoe abandoned in long grass. Let the stars appear and the moon disclose her silver horn. Let the fox go back to its sandy den. Let the wind die down. Let the shed go black inside. Let evening come. To the bottle in the ditch, to the scoop in the oats, to the air in the lung, let evening come. Let it come as it will, and don't be afraid. God does not leave us comfortless. So let evening come. And finally, here is an old prayer for evening from the Book of Common Prayer. O Lord, support us all the day long, until the shadows lengthen, and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed, and the fever of life is over, and our work is done. Then, in your mercy, grant us a safe lodging and a holy rest and peace at the last. Amen.
Welcome to Pulpit to Pew, a podcast that features a conversation between priest and parishioner to understand how the message translates and to further explore the weekly lessons within the Episcopal tradition and daily life. The Very Reverend Beverly Gibson, Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, and Johnny Gwynn, a newcomer to the Episcopal family, discuss what Beverly intended and Johnny heard, or got wrong.
To find some things.
Right.
But I took some time, and for the other podcast that I do at Deep Fried Studios, I got some people to do some editing for me to take away all that work.
Right.
And it allowed me to do some bigger things.
Some other things, right.
And so I went looking at, how else can we maximize this channel that we have. Mm-hmm. Having that time allowed me to find these little buttons I should have pushed, a year ago.
Well, we get in such a hurry to do the things that we're obligated to do, and then we pile on more of those obligations. And so we often do worse and worse about the many things we do, when if we found some way to move those into a different place, we could do better work.
Well, you do get into a different state of mind. You go from do,
right.
And especially deadlines. That's the thing about a podcast. Because the email has to go out.
Right. It's coming.
On
Thursday's
Thursday,
coming. That's right.
And my other shows have dates too. I have a real estate show called Agent 251 that drops on Thursday morning. I have an insurance guys podcast that drops on Wednesday. So the idea is I live by these deadlines, but if you keep pushing the deadlines back, everything starts getting hurried.
Yeah.
And you don't have time for thinking, because all you're really doing is going down the to-do list to hit it. And I mean, I like those I like those tasks. I like those limits, because it does set your schedule for you.
Right.
But if you get so locked into that schedule, you start losing the humanity of it.
Well, you do. And you have to not always be on that same schedule, or else you can't understand and critique the schedule itself.
Yeah, while it's great for consistency for the product, it's bad for the maker.
Yes.
Because, because it's like TV.
Which end up being bad for the recipient,
Well, exactly, because you end up how can I add more color or add more nuance to what my creation is if I'm only doing what I did yesterday?
Right.
And that goes back into the idea of our spirituality that I'm getting to, and my correlation to work and spirituality is if we're just going through that hurried life, which we already have, and that, Sunday is the Sabbath, so Sunday will be the day that I give my time, which you don't. You give your time in church. Right. And then you say, I honored my Sabbath. What you're talking about is Sabbath is actually maybe not even a Sunday. Maybe it's a day, it's a time, it's a space that you give to not only just slowing things down, but to honoring that time to listen to God's calling and things you're not listening to.
Right. It's a whole way of being. And that, if you go back to the Genesis story that was at the beginning of the meditation, God works for 6 days and rests on the seventh, which, of course, yes, we have weeks, and there are 6 days, and then there's 7 days, and that's fine, and I'm not discounting that. But it's meant to be seen as a whole rhythm for creation and for life and for being, that there are periods of work, and then there have to be periods of rest. And so the same is true in any given day. The same is true in your week. The same is true in the larger year of your life. The same is true in the seasons of your life. That there has to be some time to step back and to rest and reflect. And if you think about the Genesis story is just so wonderful, because in very clear and almost poetic language, it says, and God saw everything that he had made. And indeed, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. He had to step back, even God, to see, what is it that I've done?
The big picture.
Right. What is this that I've done? And now I'm going to rest and let that be. And then life moves on. And if that's the pattern, then we have to honor that pattern. So honor the Sabbath day is not to abuse that, not to abuse the creation and ourselves as part of creation, and not to believe in a kind of prideful way that we're somehow or other better than that we are superhuman or we're able to just push through. And that is countercultural, I think, right now. I think we are very tied up in productivity.
Yeah, that's the hustle.
Hustle.
But there's a switch back to that. A lot of the social influencers and corporate influencers are now saying, we did that for a while and that got us somewhere, but it was good and it was kind of bad. We also need to, it is that hustle, and then, like you said, step back and then analyze what you're doing. There's another show that I do. They do a lot of training, management training, right? And one of the things that one of the teachers said to this person that I was doing the podcast was, are you overwhelming your staff with learning? Meaning, if you're making them learn a new lesson every week, what are they absorbing?
Right.
So the idea was to go backwards. It's teach 20, implement 80, instead of teaching 80, implement 20, with the idea of, like, what's the purpose of all these lessons if you're not bringing it into your life? And you're just, it's just one more thing. I read this book by, Zig Ziglar. I read this book by whoever. But if you're Dale Carnegie and you're reading all this, but you're not incorporating anything, all you're doing is building up this like hoard of information. So you have to step back and say, okay, I read Zig Ziglar, I read Dale Carnegie, I read this. How do I step back and make this make any sense to give positivity to my productivity? Right.
And even a step beyond that, to go back to something that we talked about last time when we talked about the unthinkable part of the mind, right? That part of our being that we don't have conscious access to. Rest takes account of that. So I can look at something and I can analyze it and I can say, okay, how is this work rhythm working for my staff, and how are all of these programs working within our church, or if it's a business, the same thing. I can do that. I can analyze that. But if I'm still stuck in my mode, right, if I'm still stuck in my critical mode, I'm still not seeing the fullness of it. I have to find a way to flip the switch. I have to find a way to not be in that mode and let the unthinkable side have its time to do that.
Well, yeah.
And then I come back. That's like taking time away. And you see that with lots of professionals and business people, too, who will, at a certain point in time, especially if they've done well enough to be able to afford it, leave.
Yeah.
They will just say, look, I'm going someplace for a month, or I'm taking a year off.
Yes, the famous designer Stefan Sagmeister, he takes a year off every 6 years, and he has to, because and then he does. He re-invitalizes, he remolds what he does because of that. Because you have to get into a pattern of, if you're super busy, you have to figure out your pattern to take the time to be quiet.
Right.
And if you don't have the pattern, all you're doing is like a robot. You're, like the train going 90 miles an hour, and what's going to happen? The train's going to end up derailing because you haven't given the motor time to slow down.
Right.
And another thing, too, is humans get so locked in, or I get so locked into when I'm creating something, that I'm so locked into the 3-inch square of the 3-inch by 3-inch square, and it's a 30 by 30 piece, right? And like you said, God had to step back and say, "Whoa, this is pretty cool. Look what we did." And you get so locked in that 3-inch by 3-inch square that when you step back, you don't realize what you've done. You say, "Oh, I'm not getting anything accomplished," but when you step back, take that time, you realize the fruits of my labor have been really quite amazing. I just don't see it because I'm so, what's that, forest for the trees, right?
Right.
I see the wait, how's that work? You see the tree but not the forest, right?
Well, I'm so close to the trees that I don't see the whole forest.
So I see the whole forest, right.
Well, the other thing that you can do in that place is that you keep working and reworking on that 3-inch square without realizing that you were probably done with that 3-inch square a month ago.
Yeah, I'm working on doing that right now in Photoshop.
It's like, just stop.
Yeah.
And that's the pattern of God. I mean, this is all creation. It's like, well, I work for 6 days and I could probably do better because I'm God. If I kept creating, then it would keep being good. But he steps back and he says, this is very good.
Well, it is. It kind of reminds me of like a software he kind of made, because it's not finished, right?
Right.
But the basic platform's there, so variables are added to it. That's what. It's not like it's a painting. A painting's kind of done, right? But if you make a software package, other things because we're part of the creation, right? We're part of that partnership with that. We're adding to it, but the foundation is there, and that's what was perfect, And then the experiment starts,
right?
Good and bad,
That's
right?
how we do. Well, and Jesus says about that. He says, humankind was made. Well, back up.
The Sabbath was made.
The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath.
That just hit me. Again, that thing of, I think I knew what that meant until it really hit me on Sunday. I was like, oh, wait a minute. God did not create us for Sabbath. The Sabbath was created for us, to help us.
Right.
He's not waiting for us to get on our bended knee and take that day. What I'm reading that is Jesus is saying, no, that day is actually for you to get closer to God, and you getting closer to God creates a different pattern in your life that will be more fruitful.
Right. And thus his anger with the Pharisees, because what he sees in them is a refusal of God's grace. To acknowledge that God gave this to you. God gave it to everybody.
It's a gift that
it's a gift.
Yeah.
So don't just pound on it. Don't distort it. Don't turn it into something that is about you and about your rules and about your way of doing things.
Well, the cruelty
Let it be.
And the cruelty of the guy with the hand, right? So it's Sunday, and the idea is, so the right thing to do would be to help this person, but because of some written law or law that you say is a law, you don't give that compassion. There's the sin.
Right.
And it's the whole thing, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and he does say in that passage too, is there no giving of life on the Sabbath? I mean, people are born on the Sabbath. People die on the Sabbath. The rhythm of life continues. So the Sabbath must be not just about the day and not just about rules of the day, but about that larger rhythm of all of creation.
Yeah. What I think is interesting is maybe Sunday's not convenient, and that sounds awful.
Yeah.
But even if you start to find just time to say, you know what, I'm going to make this the point where whatever it is, out in nature, reading the Bible, whatever you find that moments to say, I'm going to start using this moment to listen and to find a closer relationship with God in not just evening prayers, morning prayers, and church.
Right.
Anytime you can find that, I think it's a positive because you are, again, you're being active.
Right.
And not passive in the idea of, I'm going to find this time and I'm going to use it to find a closer relationship with God.
Right. And it's meant to be within the rhythm of your day, within the rhythm of your week, within the rhythm of your year.
Yeah.
That is really meant to be a pattern. And I hate to bring this back to myself, but in my case, and this is a bit of a challenge, Sunday, even though it is the Sabbath, is not a Sabbath for me necessarily because I'm working.
Because that's your big day.
I'm on. It's the day. So the challenge is, if that's your reality, when does your Sabbath day come? And as I had to confess this to my vestry, I went back and read my letter of agreement, which is a good thing to do once in a while because you find stuff in there that you forgot.
What you agreed to work with.
Well, the things that I said that I would abide by that I don't make myself do, and one of those things is that I will take one continuous 24-hour period each week as a time for myself and my family.
Mm-hmm.
And that is harder to do than you think.
Mm-hmm.
Because we all obligate ourselves to lots of other things. Things happen, crises occur, you get a phone call, or you're tempted just because there's an open area on your calendar to put something in it.
Mm-hmm.
When someone says, when can you do whatever? And you say, well, there's a space right there, I can do that. Instead of honoring that space and saying, that is really a holy space that I am doing violence to and doing violence to myself by stacking stuff up in it because I need to leave it free.
And that's a strong word, violence, but I think it's smart because if you're ignoring something, instead of being a word like not paying attention to, it's not strong enough. If you say, like even your health, we were talking about health earlier, when you don't go to the dentist like you need to, you're doing violence to your body because over time, it's slow violence, but it is when it hits a point, it's pretty brutal. You have mistreated your body to the point of you might as well go and just smash your teeth. It just took you 10 years instead of 10 seconds.
Yeah, you're doing a time lapse. You are smashing your teeth but over a long time.
Yeah. So you're doing that to your spirit, to your soul, and to your life, because it's in little micro movements and not one large thing. That's why we don't see it as we're going into it.
Right. I think we've talked at some point, maybe we haven't, about the Enneagram, and I don't want to go down to the depths of that, but if you are an 8, as it appears I might be, then one of the things that you do is that you push and you push and you push. That you have a vision or you have a project, and if you're really an unhealthy 8, you not only you push yourselves, but you push everyone around you.
Mm-hmm.
And you get yourself into that rhythm, and you're blind to what you're doing, and it can get, these are hard words, but belligerent or bullying even.
Mm-hmm.
And you do it to yourself.
It's like a drill sergeant.
It is.
Yeah.
And one of the things that can happen too when you're doing that is that you will ignore your own well-being and your own health. And you say, I'm so busy. This is so important. And my vision is so all-encompassing.
Yeah.
I cannot go to the doctor because I'm not sick. Therefore, I don't need to go to the doctor. Or my teeth are okay, therefore I don't need to go to the dentist.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of realizing that there are other things just as important
the unseen
as the agenda that you are pushing right now. And when I drew up the example of my sabbatical last year, I was so in the groove of pushing that when I planned that thing, I planned it out truly like a forced march, and I dragged my family along with me.
But that was you wanted to pack in as much as you could do in a short amount of time.
And I did.
I really liked the example of your son learning Chinese letter forms.
Yeah.
So the so the letter form for busy is heart and killing. Which, boy, that is quite prophetic.
Right. Well, and to think back to the violence idea that we so overvalue things external to us that we kill the life in us.
That's that things seem so important. Things seem so, that 3 inch by 3 inch square, right? Seems so important until a major accident happens, and all of a sudden it's like, boy, that 3 by 3 inch square sure was an important one. I don't know. Something's in the hospital, something's this, and then it's like, wow, that's that snapback, everything pulls like a big slingshot. And then you let it go and you realize it's so loose at that point because that one thing just proved everything you thought was so big is so small.
Right. And that is tough because when something happens, when someone dies, when there's a health crisis, we say time stops, right? We want all those obligations to stop, and many of them can. But I will tell you from my own recent experience, it's tough because if you have obligated yourself in many, many, many ways and other people are depending on the obligations that you've made, sometimes you can't stop. Or you have to keep going. But if you don't build in intentionally the time to stop, once you do that, then you will kill yourself.
Sabbath was made for humankind. And I started using Sunday as a day of work. I just did. I did my church thing, right? And I did this, and then this afternoon opens up. Well, I looked at it as like, I can sneak in 5 or 6 more hours.
Right.
And sometimes there's certain times there's certain things like necessities. You've got to pay bills or whatever it is, deadlines approaching. But if you start getting into a habit where that is the norm, not the exception, you are doing damage. You are. Damage to your faith. I guarantee you I'm doing damage with my relationship with my wife because she's getting pretty bored because she wants to do fun things and not doing that. And then you're slowly over time killing those relationships. And I think Killing the Sabbath will be the name of this.
Really
that's a good title.
It is.
But it also sounds like a Bill O'Reilly book, killing Hitler,
Jesus, killing
the Sabbath. But I know it's strong to say those words, but are we doing that? That's what you have to sit back and say, am I using my time not to go, but to listen? And that's to take the time. And people in our culture, they say, "Oh, you lazy bones! You're sitting there thinking. What are you just sitting there thinking? That's not doing anything." There is not a premium on the idea of boredom. We've talked about that before with that deep work book.
Right.
There's no value on when someone thinks you're being lazy. You're not being lazy. You're processing maybe the week or that kind of thing.
Right. And if much of what you do, like much of what I do, well, not much, it should be more of what I do any given week is to try to write something. And you want to squeeze that in to this little hour or 2 hours, you're doing violence to what it is within you that you're trying to honor and to bring forth.
Yeah. Because
it's not going to work like that. Anybody who writes much at all will tell you that there's a great deal of vacant time there. While those things are kind of moving around inside you and moving around in your head, and you have to put your hand on the keyboard or your pen to the paper, but at the same time, it doesn't happen according to your schedule.
Right. It's got to come to you.
Right. It's got to come to you, or you have to come to it. You have to allow it to come, like the Sabbath. You have to make yourself available for it to come. And that means, as most people who write it all will tell you, putting in the hours.
Yeah.
And hours, not an hour.
Yeah.
I'm very bad about blocking out a little bit of time and saying, I've got this much time to do it. It's the deadline concept.
Yes.
And while that can be effective, in the long run, it's not.
It's a destroyer.
Yeah.
So I just watched a movie called Rebel on the Rye, which is about J.D. Salinger.
Yeah.
Really good.
I've wanted to watch that. I read about it.
But to him, religion was writing. Like he got to where that, I think he was a Buddhist or maybe It was Eastern. He found after he had PTSD after World War
Right.
II, real bad,
Uh-huh.
and so he found a
This
lot.
is J.D. Salinger.
J.D. Salinger, yeah, had a lot of. He found a lot of relief in transcendental meditation, and it doesn't really say who he trained with, but he kind of did. But then he found his meditation was actually writing, but not writing for publishing, just to write.
To write, yes.
And so there's a part in the movie where he talks. His teacher tells him as a young man, "Are you willing to spend your life dedicated to this craft of writing and get nothing out of it?" That is the question you have to ask.
Right.
And of course, at 21, you're like, yes, or you're some ridiculous way. You're like, you'll promise anything because you want whatever you want, fame, whatever. He found that fame was the worst thing for him.
Right.
The writing is what he loved. And he did at the end of the movie, it talks about he can finally answer that question to the teacher and said, believe it or not, the one thing that I can do is I will give my life to this because it took me a long time to get here. But writing for nothing is the only way that I'm happy. That goes, I think, back to this idea of he found his peace in this action that was very, very reverent. And you take your time, you have your space, you make your space. He made this part in his house where no one could come. He did his writing. Well, we need to do that, I guess, or part of that in our spiritual life with that. Well, it'd be nice to say I'm giving up my life to like a monk, like you think of a hermit monk,
right?
But that doesn't work in my life right now. But to take a small space, but to dedicate that thing of like I'm going to do all this to get nothing out of it. There's nothing. I'm doing it out of the sheer pleasure of getting to love it, with the idea of nothing's coming back of it other than the time that I have promised to give to this Sabbath, this space.
Well, in the end, as the elders would remind us, in the end we take nothing with us at all except who we are and who we've been and what we offer to God. So we do make idols out of the things that we believe we are accomplishing, whatever those things may be, whether it's building an organization, whether it's producing a body of work, that really becomes the idol. When in fact, the true self, the place where God dwells, and the being that God loves and wants to see flourish is not those things. Those things are, yes, our work, but they are not the ultimate being that we are called to be. You use the example of a hermit or a monk, and that's a good illustration. We tend to think of them as doing only one thing, right? They are just being. But in fact, monastic life is very ordered and structured.
Some made beer and wine.
Right. But around periods of work and rest and even play.
Right.
That there is a rhythm to that life.
And it's very regimented in the monastic life,
Right. And while we're not monastics, we are called to find some rhythm and some order, often for most people called a rule of life, to look at those 4 or 5 areas of life that we've just talked about: work, rest, play, hospitality, worship. How do those things balance out in my life? It's not like I'm going to take a bullet journal and, carve up every day in boxes and put them in there. But what is the rhythm of my life, and how does that work for me? And where do I put those things together? Somebody like Salinger had to find over time what that space and what that rhythm was for him. And his rhythm obviously is not what it's going to be for most people.
When he found his space, he also drove away everybody. He really became a weird monk.
He did.
But again, everybody figures out how they're going and the patterns and motions of their lives. Someone's going to sit there and try to actually box out on that bullet journal.
Sure.
I mean, and that starts becoming, it feeds upon itself. It's the snake eating itself of like, you're putting so much regimentation to your life that you're almost like a robot living on this automation.
Well, you are. And I say that as someone who does sometimes try to do that. If we go back to the Deep Work book that we've talked about before.
Cal Newport.
Right. Even though that's pretty regimented sometimes in the way that it's drawn out, if you really dive into what he recommends. The basic concept is that there have to be big blocks of time that you give up to to being in the work or whatever it is you're going to do, that it cannot happen in little isolated chunks.
Yeah.
It has to have space. And I think the same thing is true for Sabbath, that it has to have space. The church pension fund gave out little door hangers. I have one now that's on the back of my door. It's never on the front of my door. That says, you're supposed to put it on your doorknob and close your door, and it says, I'm taking a 10-minute Sabbath. Well, I don't know. I mean, so the church pension fund says I get a 10-minute Sabbath. Well, thank you. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be.
Well, that goes to one of the drawings I have where I was going to do closed on Sunday because the idea, because you think, oh, you shut everything down to honor the Sabbath. It's just the opposite.
Right.
You shut down maybe your business, but you open yourself up.
You do.
So open on Sunday actually is more
way.
of, but you should wear it on your neck.
Right. I'm being open now.
Right. And then, but it is. I love the idea of like not shutting down. You're actually opening up.
Yes, you are.
And because, like the story of Eli and Samuel. Samuel, he didn't know that calling was coming from God. He had to be that quiet time, that night time, that when everything is still is when he heard that,
Right.
Well, when in life do we get that quiet time? Well, you know what? It probably is 5 a.m.
Might be.
And that's when a lot of these very much entrepreneur people will tell you, I get everything done between 5 and 7 in the morning because the world is quiet and then I can get to my business.
Yeah.
Or think about things.
Yeah.
So now I'm stuck between open on Sunday or killing Sabbath for the title. So now I'm back and forth. So
it will come to you if you're open.
Well, I need let a lot of things go. That let go of the Sabbath is really. Let the Sabbath come to you and let things go is a really big thing. That when you're wound tight like I am, it's hard to let go of that rope.
It is, and
that's where faith comes in, though.
Well, it is, but you have, when you think that you're holding onto the rope is what is keeping everything going, you have made a mistake.
Yeah.
And I say that as someone who does that all the time. And I did learn this from my sabbatical time. Things go on quite well without my being there every minute.
I think I used to say when I had my advertising agency, I was like, I have overestimated the value of my time in this building because I took a month, and I think they worked better when I came back because of my time away.
Yes,
because I had caused so many barriers, and then me going away gives somebody else some freedom too. So you have to again. We go back to this time. You have to take something in your life. You need to take some time to reflect and rest the motor and rest the brain. But it also goes to time of that open time, that free time. You don't have a plan what's going to happen, and you sit and you wait to see what will happen.
Right.
Darn it, I spent time to take where something's going to happen to me, and it's going to happen now.
If you've got 10 minutes to happen, and if you don't happen in 10 minutes, I'm out of here.
Yeah, if you're on a regimented enlightenment path, you're really looking for you're never going to find that enlightenment.
Enlightenment, or to use the other term, that inner awakening. The inner awakening is not going to happen on your schedule.
So can I put that on my schedule? It says Sunday, June 27th.
Inner awakening.
Awakened soul, enlightened, questions of all being and peace.
Looking forward to it.
If only thing for that easy. Well, this has been wonderful. Beverly, thank you so much.
Thank you, Johnny.
This has been Pulpit to Pew, and I'm Johnny Gwynn.
I'm Beverly Gibson.
And Beverly will end on your final word.
Amen.
If you'd like to know more about Beverly Gibson and Christ Church Cathedral, please visit christchurchcathedralmobile.org. There you'll find information on the church, Reverend Beverly Gibson's recorded sermons, and sermon notes. If you want to know more about Johnny and his Sabbadoodles, visit pulpittopew.com. I would also like to thank Deep Fried Studios and producer Stacy Wellborn. Without her, this show would not get made. If you have any comments, likes, dislikes, please send information to Stacy at deepfriedstudios.com. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for listening.